Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining today's webinar. My name is Sam Jackson. I'm one of the solutions architects here at Softworks. For you that don't know me, I've worked at Softworks for about 5 years now, both within the projects team and the pre-sales team. Today's webinar is going to be focused around ultimately simplifying the complexity of endpoint privileges, in particular around the Microsoft Endpoint Privilege Management solution from Microsoft. So looking into a bit of endpoint privileges, focusing that around zero trust, how this adheres to the zero trust framework and other frameworks such as Cyber Essentials and your ISO standards. And we're also looking into a bit of the implementation of the product as well. And at the end, we've got a bit of a live demo just so we can kind of see it firsthand from an end user's perspective as well. So just a couple of bits on the agenda, like I say, focusing around the endpoint privileges to start with, moving into a bit of zero trust in the endpoint privilege management framework, also referred to as EPM in the Microsoft world. So if I refer to endpoint privilege management as EPM, that's why. We'll look into a bit of the introduction of endpoint privilege management. We'll go through the different elevation scenarios and configurations within the product, and also look into a bit of the reporting and auditing as well from an IT administrator perspective as well. Following that, we'll move into how we actually plan for the implementation. We'll look at the licensing, the prerequisites, and actually the best practice of deploying the product if you guys do choose to adopt this as well. And like I said, we've got a bit of a live demo that we'll run through as well in a virtualized machine that I've got running as well. So to get started with endpoint privileges, what's the challenges around having users with privileges to elevate their admin access to devices? Now, there's a big balance between productivity and security. You know, you want to allow your users to be productive, you want to give them the tools and the capabilities to do what they need to do, but we also need to make sure that our organization is secure and we're following our zero trust frameworks. Now, in terms of endpoint privileges, one of the challenges here is that too many users have local admin rights. Nowadays, it's not as much as an issue. However, there are still a lot of organizations who have users with local admin privileges. And typically, you actually find that that's with the IT team themselves. You won't give a standard user local admin rights, but the IT team themselves will have local admin rights with their standard user account because they're IT aware, they will have certifications, they'll have knowledge around cybersecurity, but that doesn't reduce the risk of an incident happening due to that user having local admin rights. And that's why certifications such as Cyber Essentials Plus and ISO do specify that you need to have a separate local admin account to your standard user account. However, as we know, not everyone follows those practices. You can see here we've got removing admin rights breaks productivity and support processes. Typically what you'll find is if you've got an organization with a development team who need to run software such as Visual Code, Docker, PowerShell scripts, they need local admin rights to run those processes. And if they don't, that then means there's a help desk ticket, or they need to reach out if you're in the office to one of the IT team to put their credentials in. So it slows down their productivity and ultimately increases the workload on the help desk with more tickets as well. In addition to that, there's a large lack of visibility over users who have got local admin rights. If a user's got local admin rights on the device, other than the event viewer, there's no real auditing that goes on. So you don't actually know when the user has elevated their privileges. You're not aware of what application, process, or sub-process they have actually elevated at any point in time. So there's a massive kind of gray area there that we need to address. And lastly, just a point on kind of attackers themselves. So you can see we've got attackers exploit admin rights for lateral movement and persistence. It's one of the main ways that attackers get into the environments is they will utilize the local administrator account. They'll have persistent access to that device, and ultimately they're going to have access to a lot more within the environment as well, whether that be server local admin access, domain controllers, application servers. They've got control. As soon as they've got control, they're going to begin to laterally move around the environment. So we need to address that. You've obviously got different ways of elevating privileges. You've got the UAC prompts, but again, it slows down productivity because you need a local admin to come and put that in. They need to remote into the device to put their credentials in. If the user has got a separate local admin account, well, that's maintaining a separate local admin account as well. So you've got more productivity reducement in the world of elevation of applications and processes. So endpoint privilege management, why is it useful and what does it do? So Microsoft Endpoint Privilege Management, it enables your organization's users to run a standard user account, but also have the capability to elevate applications or scripts or services as an administrator without actually needing to have a second admin account to raise a ticket to the help desk. Loads of different ways what it's used, and this is what we'll touch on. So you can see here, removing standing admin rights, best practice, no standard user account should have local admin right to their device at all. You've got on-demand per app elevation. So as an IT admin, you can define what applications are allowed to be elevated based off a set of rules and conditions, which we'll touch on a little bit more as well. That falls into the granular policy controls. Again, we'll touch on that in a bit more detail, but it's ultimately around controlling what applications can be elevated based off a set of defined rules by your IT team, and that will follow your least privileged access controls and ultimately give you that kind of audit trail there as well around what elevations have happened, has it been approved, what sub-processes were executed, and what processes were executed at the same time as well. Ultimately, what we're doing there is reducing the attack surface. The less local admins we've got, the better. Like I say, the more local admins you've got on the device, the more risk you've got for lateral movement and malicious activity on those devices or those user accounts if they've got access to servers or they've got access to multiple devices. And in terms of the productivity side of things, you've got fewer help desk tickets. Help desk nowadays are always busy, they've got loads going on, and those smaller requests, whether it be a password change or an elevation to a application, they usually fall down into your P3, P4 priority tasks. So they get seen later on and they get addressed later on, which ultimately will slow down the productivity of that end user who's trying to do their business as usual activities on their device. So endpoint privilege management steps in here by giving the capabilities to the end user to elevate, but also allowing the IT administrators to know or approve an application or service based off of what they've predefined. So zero trust and compliance, how does it fall into this? So typically what you'd find with anything such as Cyber Essentials or ISO, if anyone's ever gone through those frameworks, you'll know that a user account with local admins is an immediate failure and it needs remediating immediately. It's a big no-go. Now, with endpoint privilege management, as well as solutions such as PIM, privileged identity management, it's always been a bit of a grey area because Cyber Essentials and ISO are usually a little bit further behind in the times of the technology around endpoint privileges. However, with Cyber Essentials and ISO, they define that standard user accounts cannot have local admin access to their device. Now, the way that endpoint privilege management actually works is it doesn't elevate the standard user accounts admin rights. It doesn't elevate them and add them to the local administrators group within the device. It actually creates an entirely separate, isolated, virtualized service account. And even that service account isn't added to the local admin group. So as far as ISO 27001 Cyber Essentials are concerned, that standard user account doesn't have admin rights to the device. It's a virtualized service account. Little bit of a difficult one to explain because the assessors will probably challenge that, but ultimately it is compliant to that degree. So in terms of zero trust, you can see that we've got identity. Users authenticate normally, but privileges are no longer tied to that identity alone because it runs through that separate service account. In terms of devices, you've got least privilege enforced at the endpoint. So we're not enforcing it at the identity level, we're enforcing it at the device level, which then initiates that service account through identity. In regards to the applications, you've got elevation only occurs for trusted and validated applications. Again, that comes from the IT administrators, the IT team, predefining what applications do we trust. Do we know that it's the application that we've defined that's running, it's not been spoofed? And it puts that control in the IT admin. It follows the zero trust. Obviously, with zero trust, the main aim of that is that we don't trust anything unless we've explicitly said the identity of the user has access, the device has access, we've got log feeds of what's going on the device, and we also know that the application is trusted as well. So it's always about validating any activity within a business and following that zero trust framework. And lastly, there you've got the logging. So every elevation is logged. We'll look through some of the reports and auditing in this demo as well. However, if you have got a SIEM solution, in particular Microsoft Sentinel or Softworks' Secure 365 solution, all of that is logged into Microsoft Sentinel. So you've got your 90-day retention there on logs. We can investigate those, and you've got that as an audit trail as well, outside of just your Intune reporting model. So your zero trust and compliance does fall into the endpoint privilege management solution itself, rather than having to have local admin users or having separate accounts. So it gives that productivity balance between security and zero trust. So how does it actually work? So a user can run an application, and that's defined through a different couple of policies. You've got your elevation settings and you've got your elevation rules. We'll look at those in the next couple of slides, but effectively that's how that's going to work. User runs an application, the policy is evaluated, meaning the application has been set up and the device can adhere to the rule set that's been defined by the IT team ahead of time. That request is either approved or denied. It's either approved manually for a support request, or it's approved via a predefined file hash or certificate of the application. And we'll touch on that in a little bit more detail as well. Once that action is completed, the event is logged, and the user is then able to run or not run the application that's been requested to be elevated. So a relatively simple process. User can elevate the application. If it's allowed, it can run. If it needs support request, that will go to the IT team. So you've got that flexibility around how you actually want your end users to be able to elevate privileges based off the type of application they want to elevate. Give you a bit of an example. If a user wants to execute a PowerShell script, that PowerShell script should really go through a support request, because you don't necessarily know what's in that PowerShell script itself. Whereas if a user wants to elevate an application such as Notepad++, well, that's a relatively standard application, it's trusted, and you might feel the need that a user can elevate that application because we know what it is, we know it's trusted, and there's no malicious capabilities within Notepad++ itself. You could manipulate it, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a non-malicious application. So you can predefine that. There's no limit to those predefined applications. You could have loads. And we'll touch on that a little bit more as well. So in terms of your elevation types, the first setting here, if you've got, is the elevation setting policy. Now, what this setting does is it controls the way the endpoint privilege management client actually behaves within the device. So when you onboard a device into endpoint privilege management, you can see in the program files, there'll be a new folder created called endpoint privilege management, and that's effectively the repository in which all of these capabilities are built into. What that elevation setting policy does, it allows you to define the default response for any elevation request that does not match a policy. Now, what that means is if you've got a list of 10 applications, Notepad++, PuTTY, Visual Studio, Google Chrome, Firefox, if you've got rules defined for those applications, then at the point of elevation, the endpoint privilege management will go off and adhere to those rules, whether that be a support request, an automatic approval, etc. However, if I try to execute a application as administrator that wasn't defined in a rule, such as OneNote, something simple like that, then you can define the default action for endpoint privilege management. And the recommendation there from Microsoft is denial. because we want to deny, following our least privilege, following our zero trust, is we want to deny anything that our IT team has not predefined. And that's because we haven't trusted it. We haven't looked into the application, or it's not on the list to be approved yet. So you want to make sure that you're denying everything unless it's been defined by the IT team. And that falls into the next part there, the elevation rule policy. And what that does is it effectively just defines the way that the applications can run based off of the binaries, off the scripts, off the file hashes, off of the context of the application itself. In terms of elevation types, we've got different ways that we can actually elevate applications from an end user perspective, and we'll touch on those in the next slide. But the diagram that you can see there in the bottom right is actually the flow of how elevation happens. So you've got a detected EPM driver, so a user has attempted to elevate something. You can see this one here is an automatic elevation at the top left. That means that the IT administrator has said that you can automatically, without approval, elevate this application because it's been predefined and it's been approved by the admin. That's not best practice, but it's a capability within the system if you do want to. You've got user initiated, and this is the one that is typically the best practice, is the way to go forward. Because what happens at the point of a user initiated elevation request is you can define whether you need to have business justification for that application to be elevated, and you can also trigger a Windows authentication request for that as well. At the point of that happening, the EPM client will go for the rule match, so it'll start to match the rules to the Intune deployment, and then it will either go through the default elevation behavior, meaning the elevation request is not a predefined application within Endpoint Privilege Management, or it will have a rule match where, for example, support approved, and that will facilitate the elevation based off of what's been defined by the IT team. And that's how that flow ultimately works. So your elevation types. Like I mentioned, you've got your automatic endpoint privilege management automatically elevates these applications through input from the user. However, this broadens the scale because we're not following least privilege at that point, and we're not necessarily following zero trust. The point of automatic is that a user can automatically approve themselves to run as administrator. So yes, you can define the application that can be run as administrator. However, the IT team still doesn't know that what if that application is actually being used maliciously. For example, if you have a PowerShell script that's being automatically approved, how do we know that that PowerShell script's not been manipulated and is not being used to inject SQL injections into an application or database? So you always want to have some form of user initiation in there, and that's the next point there as well. User initiation allows the user to elevate their access, however, providing extra validation, authentication, and business justification. So it gives us more of an audit trail of what's happened on that device, what's the reason for the elevation, and can you also prove to me that it's you that's elevating this application by using multi-factor authentication. So we're following that zero trust framework. We're following the least privilege model there. You've got Elevate as current user. Elevate as current user is effectively running an application as your standard user account. So you might as well have the user having local admin rights at that point. You know, the point of Elevate as current user basically means that standard user account can elevate any of the applications that have been pre-approved. At that point, the user got pretty much control of any of the applications that have been defined, and that's not what we want, and that is not following your best practice. Although it's there, it's not your best practice. You can see here this mode runs the elevated process under the signed in user account, whereas all of the other approval mechanisms work with that virtualized service account. So it's a completely separate account, and that's why it would adhere to your cyber essentials, and that's why it would adhere to your ISO frameworks as well, because they are technically separate accounts. You've got support approved. Now, this is your best practice, support approved. We always want to make sure, although we've defined that the application is safe to be run as elevated admin, but we want our IT team to approve that regardless, because we need to follow that zero trust. So what the support approval does is it will put a request through to the administrator, and in the Intune portal, anyone with the appropriate role-based access, I believe the role's the Intune administrator request admin, that will allow you to approve or decline elevations of an application, and that is what Microsoft want you to follow, because again, it needs to go through those layers of zero trust and least privilege. In terms of support approvals, so obviously following on from that, that's the best practice. That's the way we want to go. So you've got two different options of your support approvals. You've got approve, and that will allow the user to run the file as a elevated admin for the next 24 hours. And that is the default, and that's what's defined. That's not changeable. You've got your denials, so you can deny the request. However, at this moment in time, Microsoft do not notify the user through a notification toast within the Windows operating system. It's a manual kind of conversation there. So either replying to a ticket, reaching out to the user over Teams, or your form of communication to the user. So that will hopefully be coming. But at the moment, any denials is a manual intervention to let that know to the end user. What you can see on that right hand side is just an example of a elevation request within Intune. So this is really important. So in terms of the elevation request properties, what that's going to give you, it's going to give you the information around the file. You can see here we've got Firefox installer.exe. You can see the publisher, is there a username assigned to it? What's the device that's requested that elevation? And is that device compliant? So it's important that you get your compliance policies defined ahead of time, because if a device isn't compliant, you don't want to be approving elevation of that application because the device isn't compliant. Does that mean that the device is at risk? Has it been stolen? Has it been manipulated? Is the firewall off? So you want to make sure that your Intune compliance policies are predefined and they're rock solid ultimately, because the compliance is built through the entire kind of conditional access layers as well. So we want to make sure that that's a prerequisite to the actual deployment of endpoint privilege management. You can see here you've got the request details. So you've got the pending request. You can see the last modified date and what the user justification was. So because this is a support approval, the user has to justify to me as an IT admin, why is it you need access to this application? I need to know. Even if that's a false response, I've got an audit trail of what that user said to me, why they needed access. You've got that capability of reporting and auditing, so you can hold them to it. Similar with PIM, same behavior and privileged identity management within the Azure portal. Elevating Azure role assignments also go through a level of user justification, access privileges, and things like that as well. You've got your approval expiration. So you can define at which point the approval will need to be re-requested. And you've got information around the file information as well. So you can see where the file is. In this case, it's in the downloads folder. And you've got the hash value. And you'll see a little bit more around hashes and certificates and how we use those to actually identify that the application that's being elevated is genuine and is the correct application rather than a spoofed application, for example. You've obviously there got your file version, subscription, product names, and internal names as well. So you get a load of information around the request, and you can see that. Ultimately, at that point, you may feel the need to go and reach out to the user and say, I've just seen you've made your elevation request for this application. I can see your user justification. Can you give me a little bit more information? Or maybe you'd actually want to raise that with the line manager. Is this something that the line manager has requested for them to do as part of their job? For example, if it's not their business BAU type activities, how comes you're now trying to elevate PuTTY? You don't work in the networking team. You don't need to SSH into switches. So why do you need access to that? So you've got the control. You've got that zero trust framework going on there. What you've also got, and everyone knows about Copilot and Security Copilot, it's all everyone seems to be talking about nowadays. But with Security Copilot, it's quite useful because it can automate that process that I just spoke about. It can give you the information and analyze the request in terms of the publisher, the file hash, certificates if it's in there, and it can give you that breakdown like you see on the right hand side. So you can look at the reputation details of the indicators of compromise following your MITRE frameworks. For anyone that's not familiar with your MITRE frameworks, they're effectively different techniques and tactics that attackers will use to infiltrate and manipulate into your environment, such as persistent access or brute force attacks and things like that. And that's across the entire Microsoft suite. Sentinel, for example, as well. You can see here that the elevation request, Copilot's identified the score as 100, and it's definitely classified as malicious. So it's already done the hard work there. It's already gone through the motions of looking at the application, looking at the hash, looking at the certificate, and looking at the type of application it is. So if you do have the capability to use Security Copilot, why not get it to do that work for you? Reduce that load on the IT team again, and you can rely on Security Copilot to do that. So in terms of reporting and auditing, obviously at the moment, we know that applications can be raised into administrator privileges, and we know there's different ways of doing that through your rule sets or your default setting. But as an IT admin, we want to have that reporting and auditing. And within Intune, which is where the endpoint privilege management solution is deployed, you have a collection of 6 different reports. You've got your elevation report, which shows you all of the different elevations across all of the user accounts, whether it be unmanaged or managed. You've got elevation reports by applications, so we can see which applications are being elevated the most. We can see elevation reports by user, so which user is always requesting the most admin access to certain devices. And we've also got managed elevation reports, so we can see the status of elevations that have occurred within inside the management policies that we've predefined. And lastly, you've got elevation report by publisher, so Microsoft or Google, for example, if you're elevating any Microsoft system solution, OneNote, OneDrive, Google Chrome, etc., you can see that by publisher. And you've also got the denied elevation report as well, so you can see what the IT admin team have actually denied throughout the EPM solution. So we'll touch on those a little bit more. Have a quick look through some of them to give you a bit more insight to actually what's in those reports. So in terms of planning for endpoint privilege management, how do we actually get to the deployment? What's the model for deployment? Well, first of all, you can see here on the left-hand side, you've got that explanation around isolated service accounts that will actually run the elevation process and they're not added to the local admin group. Now, if you do go through the motions of wanting to deploy EPM, your first stage here, as you can see, is license and planning. Have we got the license for it? Do we have the Intune suite? Do we have the E7 license, or do we have the endpoint privilege management add-on? If you do have the license, you can start to run through the prerequisites, which we'll touch on a little bit more as well. And then understanding the fundamentals. The fundamentals is largely what I've just spoken about, how endpoint privilege management works, following your zero trust, following your elevation requests, support approvals, your IT admins and your reporting, understanding how it really works. And then reviewing your data and privacy. That's a large one in pretty much every solution, is you need to review, constantly monitor. Now, once you've got your plan in place, you can start to deploy it. So you start with auditing the environment. You create your elevation setting policy, which is that default policy, ideally following your best practice, a deny all rule. And then you've got your elevation rule policies, which is your predefined set of rules per your application, support request, automatic approval, user initiated. Once you've deployed it, you go through the management solution, which is your support approved request, your monitoring, reporting, maintaining and updating rules, and reviewing and user privileges. So you go back through that motion of prerequisite planning, initial deployment, monitor, deployment, monitor. Pretty much everything within Microsoft follows that practice of deploy, monitor, deploy, monitor. It's all about tuning, it's all about tweaking as you go through any solution within Microsoft. Now, in terms of licensing and prerequisites, so prerequisites, Intune Suite, Endpoint Privilege Management add-on. They're the 2 licenses that you can get, whether that's Business Premium, anything that has the Intune license within your current license, you can add those on. But again, it is going to be coming into that E7 license as well, if you do want to, grasp that one. In terms of a prerequisite, so the two prerequisites that we've got here from an infrastructure aspect is Entra joined or Microsoft Entra hybrid joined, and that's because the device needs to be enrolled in Intune. If the device is not Entra joined or it's not hybrid joined, we can't get it into Intune. We need to get it into Intune. So that's your prerequisite. Majority of organizations, if you're still on-prem, you've got the on-prem domain, you've obviously got AD Connect, which can synchronize the device up into Intune with automatic enrollment. And if the device is Entra joined, you've obviously got the capability there to enroll your device into Intune manually if you do need to. That follows on to the second point there, Intune enrollment or Microsoft Configuration Manager, or SCCM as it's called. Now, in terms of the minimum supported operating system, I hope no one here is on Windows 10, but if you are, Windows 10 version 21H2 with the KB 50302111 is the minimum, but obviously that is supported all the way up to Windows 11, which I believe is on 22H2, 22H3, something like that now. So if anyone is on Windows 10, it is supported at that version, but anyone that's on Windows 11, you're going to be supported throughout this, so good stuff there. Now, in terms of the deployment model, this is the last bit before we get into it with a live demo briefly, just to show you the end user experience. So the deployment model, as I mentioned, the deployment model in majority of Microsoft products is all around auditing, building the design, monitoring, and then tweaking and tailoring your implementation so it matches your best practices. So you can see there is phase one is auditing. So you can enable the EPN client and enable reporting collection using the elevation setting policy. So what you can do is you can push out that elevation setting policy and you can let a subset of users request elevation. It will be denied, but at least it gives you a bit of an insight to what applications that your users in your business actually need to or actually would like to elevate. And at that point, it gives you the opportunity to say, okay, we've got a list of applications here. Can we break that down into personas, which is your phase two? So your personas, again, falls into the privileged identity management model, where you've got a list of users based off of the user's requirements and their roles within the business. They may have slightly more privileged access to certain areas, whether that be through elevated access or accessing certain application systems, Microsoft platforms like Azure. And that's based off their role. So you can actually start to really define what applications are published to what users and what rule sets are defined to those users, such as, do I want to allow Joe Bloggs, the IT manager, to have automatic elevation? Okay, not necessarily following your best practice there, but is an option that you can do. Such as you may want the a user in HR to be able to elevate access to a HR system as run as administrator for whatever reason, but that would need support approval because that user typically doesn't need to do that. So you may want to approve that action before that happens. And that's all around persona identification. Same with privileged identity management. Typically you have your categories. You've got your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and that would be maybe first line, second line, third line, and SLT. Your phase 3 there is building the rules. So using the information you've gathered from phase 1, using the information you've gathered around the personas in phase 2 to then start implementing all of those rule sets against those personas. And then your phase 4 is your monitoring, redefining the rules, identifying new scenarios. There's something changed. Is there a new scenario that we've identified? Do we need to harden our support approval solution instead of automatic or user initiated? Is there tweaks that we need to make sure that we're following least privilege and zero trust frameworks? And lastly, there is phase 5, reviewing your user privileges and going for that motions of monitoring, always redefining. As a lot of us will know, in IT, everything changes every other day. Microsoft love to change the name of a portal or a product, but it's the same within a business. There's always changes happening to users' operations, new departments, new members and teams, new roles, new responsibilities. So it's all around that consistent monitoring and then redefining your rules through the phase 1, 2, and 3 implementation. So just before we run into a bit of a live demo, just to give you a bit of a summary there. So endpoint privilege management is all around providing the capabilities to end users to elevate privileges without elevating their standard user account, elevating a virtualized service account based off of a preset of defined rules and policies by the IT admin team, which can be broken down into applications. That is ultimately what endpoint privilege management is doing. You know, it's bringing that productivity and that security kind of bridge into play. Whereas at the moment, you've probably got UAC prompts, you need to have those help desk tickets, you need to have a lot of interaction to elevate certain applications. We see it all the time with developers. You know, I need to run Visual Studio Code as administrator, or I need to run this Docker application as administrator, or I need to execute this PowerShell script as admin. You've got loads of different scenarios where users may need to do that, and ultimately it slows down productivity if you need to go to the help desk. And it also gives a bit more user satisfaction that I am trusted to do this, but in the back end, IT is still and always in control. And we've also got the reporting and auditing to go with that as well. Cool. What we'll do, I'm just going to stop sharing briefly, and we'll jump into a bit of a live demo. So what I've got, let me just stop sharing that. And what we'll do is we'll share this screen here. Hopefully you guys can see this. Sky Faith, we can all see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Cool. Brilliant. So this is just a machine that I've got spun up at the moment in our lab environment. So if you treat me as a standard user account, Sam Jackson, IT member within the team, and I've got a couple of different applications that I want to actually run here. So Visual Studio Code, for example. I haven't, as the IT admin, defined Visual Studio to actually be ran as an elevated privilege. I haven't defined a rule for that to happen. However, because I've defined the endpoint privilege management default action to be denial, if a user does come in here, you can see we've got run with elevated access. If I click that, my default rule setting is going to kick in place, and you can't run this app as an administrator. And that's because it's blocked. I haven't defined it as a rule. However, Notepad++, I do have a rule for. This rule here allows me to request access to run it as a administrator. So business justification, for the sake of this, we'll do test. That test will then go off to my administrator, and you can see here that the request has been sent. And if I log into here, you can see that this request has already come in to Intune for me as the administrator to actually review the request that's come in. I can see the device, I can see the compliance, ignore it's false, it's some VM. You can see the request details and the information, and I've got the capability as the admin to approve or deny that request. I'm going to approve it. I'll give the reason for approval. Again, so we've got auditing and reporting here. And then what I'll be able to do once it kicks in is I'll be able to run this application as a administrator. And you can see here in the bottom right, I've got the toast notification, request approved. So at this point, open this app as administrator, continue. And I've got admin access to that application. So it's quick. We don't need the 8-hour sync that we do with Intune with a lot of things, but it's instant in that sense. You know, that's a call of 10 seconds for that request to come through. Now, at that point, I can then have a look through the reports. The reports take a little bit longer to come through, but you can see here I've got a load of different reports and information around actually what's happened. So you can see here I've had a support approved application, Notepad++. I've got the details of that. I can also see all of the sub processes that have been executed within that admin elevation. Just to touch on that, actually, is probably a good point to mention, is within the rules in the configuration, what you're actually able to do is you're able to define if child processes are allowed to run by default. So you can either require a rule to elevate, so you'd need to define the sub process, task manager, or a PowerShell module. You can deny all, or you can allow all to run. So again, you've got that more granular control as the IT admin to do so. And you can see here, like I mentioned before, we've got that file hash. Now that file hash is retrieved for a PowerShell command. So you retrieve the file hash, and that file hash is unique to that application and that publisher itself. And that's really as simple as it is. It's slick, it's seamless. You can see the reports. You've got loads of different reports in here, managed elevation reports. You can see all of that information in here as well. So really, really useful. Hopefully that gives everyone a bit more of an insight into that product itself. Here we go. I'll leave it as not full screen. Has anyone got any questions? I see there's one in there at the moment around endpoint privilege. It's around the E7 for IT admins or general users. So that's for general users. It's for all users within the organization. That is for mainly activity into Copilot agents, the Entra suite. So it really depends on the company's budget. You know, if you've got the budget there to go to E7, if you're heavy users of the Copilot suite, Copilot agents, you want to get into the Intune suite, Entra suite, and start to explore more of those advanced features, then yeah, definitely E7's for all users across the board. And I think that's it.